Hi, and welcome back to Steven's Studio Episode 7. In today's episode, I'd like to talk about string crossings. And I'd like to focus on basic string crossings. How do you get from one string to another? For example, A to D string. So, like a lot of technique, I think it's best practiced in scales and etudes. And we're going to take the B flat major scale for today, and we're going to see what the arm does during the string crossing. So I like to break up string crossings into three parts. So we all know there are four main string levels, G, D, A, E, and associated with those are four elbow height levels, general elbow height. When we play the violin, we can play with a variety of elbow heights, and this is something I might talk about in a different episode. If I were to play an open A string, as you can see, I can play the A string with my elbow up high, really up high, raising my shoulder even. Then I could play basically flat, and I can play with a low elbow, where my elbow's actually even lower than the plane. And so I like to think of the elbow height as when the wrist is completely straight with the elbow. I like to call this C level. So at C level is basically the normal elbow height. And most people tend to play a little bit below C level, or dipping in between C level and below. And when we want to get depth in the sound, we go below. But what we can also do is play above C level. And when we have a higher elbow, of course, what that creates is this pronation in the right hand. And if you go to the extreme, of course, you can go to the Russian grip, which you're really almost raising your shoulder to get pressure. But you don't have to go to that extreme, and you can go just a little bit leaning upwards, and you can feel that you're getting more pressure by pronating. And when you go to the tip, naturally, you should do this. When you get to the tip, you don't actually want to be supinating like you are at the frog. At the frog, you need to take away weight. But naturally, as you go to the tip, there's a transfer of weight from the supination to the pronation because of the loss of sound at the tip. So in our everyday bow stroke from frog to tip, we already are using these complex motions of pronating, supination, which has to do with the elbow height. When we pronate, in order to get pressure, the elbow must actually come upwards because we need to press down into the string. And when we're supinating, it's the opposite. The hand comes up and then the elbow comes down. So by explaining all these motions, now I can get into the actual string crossing motion. So let's take the C to B flat string crossing in this B flat major scale from A to D string. What I'm doing, and the key to string crossings, is always lifting your elbow or lowering the elbow to the new string height in the note prior to the string crossing. This is a rule for every single string crossing that you'll ever do on the violin. And this has to do with the left hand, being prepared for the next note as you're playing the previous note. We don't just only think about one note as we're playing with the left hand. We have a hand frame. We have a guideline for the other fingers. So not only do you practice preparation and scales for the left hand, you also practice preparation in the right hand. And I recommend practicing scales at a very, very slow tempo, sloth speed. And this is not only for intonation, but it's also for smoothness in the bow. Like we talked about in the shifting exercise, where it feels uncomfortable at first because you're controlling every micro movement of that shift. Likewise, you need to do the same thing with the right hand with string crossings, because our arms need to become like jellyfish smooth. And in order to get there, we have to be able to control micro movements and be comfortable doing little movements like that. So what I'd like to talk about with the string crossing is there are different motions you can do with your arm. Of course, our arm comes from our shoulder. And generally in violin playing, we want to avoid lifting our shoulder. So coming from this joint up, because this doesn't really do anything. Often violinists lift their shoulder because they want to feel expressive, and naturally when you tense up, you lift your shoulder. But that doesn't really do much to the sound. In fact, it only tightens up the nerves there. What we can do is we can either raise the arm from the elbow, which is the main component during string crossings. And then what the forearm or the lower arm does in this process is it follows the upper arm. So if you watch this motion here, when I go from A string elbow height, which is about here, to D string elbow height, which is about here, in order to make it smooth, I don't just go from A to D jaggedly last minute. That's what beginners most commonly do, because in order to get from point A to point B, we think, oh, we got to snap up and go directly. In rare cases where you want to emphasize the string crossing, would you do something like that? Generally, we want smooth string crossings. I think of it almost as a cross dissolve in a video versus a hard cut. A hard cut, you're here, and then you're here. A soft dissolve in a video, we smooth out the transition. And when it becomes fast, it looks almost as if it's quick, but actually we've practiced in the smooth motion. So going back to the arm motions, you have the upwards movements of the elbow. And then, as you can see, my hand is still at the A string height. Now, with my forearm, I'm going to complete the motion of the string crossing with my forearm. And this, you can think of leading it with your right hand. So this is the head that leads. So you've got almost two heads. You've got the elbow head, and then you've got the hand head, or two things that lead. So in string crossings, we lead with the elbow to the new string, while the hand stays at the old string level. This is key, because what people often do is when they go to the new string height, they move their whole hand as well. And this is where, like a cross dissolve, when parts of the video start fading into the new video, there are still parts remaining in the old video. So the same with this right arm. When I go upwards here, part of my arm must still remain on the A string level, because I need to do this in advance. It's very difficult because as we start doing this, we feel uncomfortable because we're in a higher elbow position than what we're used to. We're here. And essentially, we're in this more pronated position. So the way I practice these string crossings and the way I teach them is I do it in 3 parts. You have the raise of the elbow, then stop the bow completely. Now complete the string crossing with your upper arm and your hand leading. You can see this motion right here. It's a very subtle motion, and notice I'm not doing anything with my elbow. My elbow stays completely there. And you can almost practice this without making any noise, just getting comfortable with this very subtle movement. If you go from G to E strings, it's more noticeable, the change. And essentially what it is this motion. Of course, when you're pronated and you're into the string, it's a little bit more subtle, but essentially what you're doing is you're leading with your forearm. With your hand as the head, this is leading. So you've got 2 motions. You've got the leading with the elbow, and then you've got the leading and completion with the hand. And this process is a 3-step process, and it's very easy to get confused and to rush certain steps of the process, which is why I teach it to stop in 3 parts. After each part, stop and assess what you're doing with each part of your arm. So the second part is the completion. After you've raised your elbow, you complete the string crossing. And then the third part is just playing on the new string. So this can almost be separated into 2 parts. The break, and then the playing and the completion of the string crossing can almost be combined into one group. But in order to be completely clear, I like to work on just the completion by itself, completely without playing the bow. Because once you've learned this motion, then you will become more comfortable making it into one motion. So of course, we're practicing this very, very slowly, and it's almost uncomfortable. Likewise for D to G strings. It's a little awkward because when we're starting to play the 3rd step, the new string, we're kind of biting the string, right? But that's because we've separated it. Now, once you've gotten the hang of it, now you start to smooth out that process. I would start with smoothing out the 2nd and 3rd steps. Start to make it into 1st step and then 2nd and 3rd steps combined. And then eventually you'll get to where it's all one motion. What's really important in practicing these string crossings is to go very, very slow and to have both the raising of the elbow and the completion at a very slow speed because you're developing control. And in order for our brains to process everything that's going on, we need to do it very slow. Eventually, it will become second nature. It's very easy for the arm to all of a sudden jerk and go very quickly. To do something like that. And that's a process of the hand completing too quickly or the arm raising too quickly. So really take your time, slowly do each step. Key thing is when I'm completing, notice how slowly I'm going up. Take your time, savor that moment between the string crossings as much as you can. There's an Izai warm-up exercise. He teaches that As you cross strings, there technically is a millisecond where you're playing both strings at once. And so as you're practicing these string crossings, I want you to feel that millisecond and really enjoy every little moment of that string crossing. Just how you enjoy every single moment of a shift when you're practicing very, very slowly. By doing this, you will eventually do string crossings very smooth, because when you want to cross fast, you have the ability to do so. But in a slow passage, for example, I don't want to have a jerky string crossing. Of course, it's still fine, but it's more amateur. You want to be able to have the full range of string crossing motions. The other thing I'd like to talk about is quick string crossings. So, of course, we understand that there are 4 elbow heights, but if you're crossing quickly between 2 strings, you don't actually want to raise your elbow up and down for every string. So, the most basic string crossing exercise I would recommend is just going back and forth between A and D strings. And what you're going to do is you're going to set your elbow height at what I call C level in the D and A strings, right here. For the D, you're going to go slightly above with your hand, and the A, you're going to go slightly below. So it creates this sort of circle. And what you're working on is controlling every single micro moment of that string crossing. So it's very easy to go, because our brains are so wired for playing on a string. And then when we go to a new string, we think, oh, we just got to jump to the new string. But take your time at a slow tempo. Even at the slow tempo, I'm still going quite fast. I want to go even slower for the string crossing. As you can see, I'm actually almost bleeding onto the new string crossing. And maybe I would actually practice string crossings this way. Of course, when you go faster, you can eliminate that bleed just because of the string crossing. And we rarely ever do string crossings this slowly. Just how when I asked to practice shifts so slowly, we rarely ever do shifts that slowly. But in order to develop the strength and consistency of the arm and the control, we need to go extremely, cruciatingly slow. So I would recommend doing this string crossing exercise very, very slow. Metronome at 60, 1 note every 2 beats. Of note, of course, this is a rapid string crossing, so you're not doing anything with your elbow. Everything happens more or less within your hand, and of course your forearm moves ever so slightly, but you guide it mainly with your hand. So you increase the tempo slowly, and then eventually you go very quick. The circle starts off quite large, and then it becomes very small. It almost becomes just a quick stroke on one string. But in some ways it's easier because you actually can feel more of this circular motion. So a very famous example of where this string crossing is used is in Mozart 39 fourth movement violin excerpt. I must credit Nathan Cole for teaching me that in this excerpt, you think of G and D string crossing height for the first four notes. Now D and A string crossing height for the next four. Now G and D, A and D. So on. D, A, now EA. Notice I'm only using my forearm. Here, A and D. Do not do. Keep your elbow at one motion. The third variable that I forgot to mention on all of this is just the arm extending for the normal bow stroke. So when I was talking about this elbow and the hand, all this must happen while performing a simple bow stroke. Of course, when we start the bow stroke, we of course have our elbow quite high. We come down with the elbow. Then when we get to maybe a third of the bow, we start extending our forearm. And then maybe the top third or fourth of the bow, that's when we have to use almost our entire shoulder to go forward and go outwards, or else the bow's going to go that way. But a common mistake is when I asked you to raise your elbow and you forget to actually continue to open your arm and go outwards with the bow. Because once you pass the third of the bow, that's when your arm must continue extending outwards. But then when you raise the elbow, we can start going crooked too much to the right side. So bow technique is very complicated, but I hope I was able to break it down into simple components. You have the basic stroke, which must stay the same. And so, of course, you should practice your open strings. Beat to 60, 4 notes per beat. Divide the bow evenly. Notice what your arm is doing for every single moment of that stroke, and then do it 2 beats on A string, 2 beats on D string. And try to maintain a straight bow while doing the string crossing components. Lifting the arm, I call that a break. And it's more noticeable when you're going from a lower string to a higher string. As you can see, my elbow height is normal on D string. It's like I break this plane with the elbow. While still maintaining this continuous motion outwards, I break the plane with the elbow. I stop, I complete, and then I continue. It's like different levels on a skyscraper or a tall building. You're in floor 4 for G string, you break to floor 3, then you continue down, and then you continue on floor 3. So I like to think of the word break. And this goes for going up or down on string crossings. It's the same either way. Going down, break, complete, go. of course, when you have bigger string crossings going from D to E string, for example, in the Schumann scherzo, then you must prepare even in advance and have an even wider staircase change. You're going from third floor to first floor. So you're jumping a floor. So think about that. And so, of course, the motion happens a little quicker, but I would still practice it at a slow tempo. So these are just some thoughts on string crossings, which are one of the hardest techniques on the violin, in my opinion, because we're focusing so much on the quality of sound on one string, yet we need to get good quality of sound on the new string, yet we need to have a smooth change between the two. And so it's very anxiety inducing because you're playing on one string, but then you're, oh no, I have to think about the new string. And then you start preparing for the new string. At the same time, you can't worry too much about the old string. And you also can't fret during the string change, which happens very much at the end of the note. And when things get smooth and as you start playing at a performance tempo, you actually shouldn't think too much about the string crossings. String crossings, I think, become more natural and intuitive, and you shouldn't think too much about them because when you start worrying about a string crossing, that's always the moment when the current note before the string crossing starts losing its quality. When I practice the string crossings, of course, I must think in advance, but that's why I really recommend breaking up the string crossing into the first part, the break, because then your mind can only focus on the first part. You're not distracted and you can maintain a good sound during a break. And then you do the rest of the string crossing. It's so easy to start worrying and lose the sound quality. And this is something that we all do in life. We worry about something in advance and we fail to do the current thing well. But if you think about it in terms of steps, you must understand that in order to do each step well, you must start from the first step doing well. And you must focus on only the first step and then go to part 2 and step 3. If you fail to get step 1 correct and smooth, then step 2 and 3 aren't going to be smooth no matter what. You might have it become smooth, but it's going to start from an unsmooth place. So always remember that you must maintain the quality of the sound until the very end of the note before the string crossing. That is something that I think about all the time in my playing. Lastly, I mentioned it briefly, but there is choreography in string crossings because we're literally changing floors and we're doing things with our elbow. So just like there's choreography in shifts, sometimes you want to be quicker, sometimes you want to be slower. With string crossings, generally you want it to be smooth and you want it to be seamless, but sometimes you want to bring out that change of string crossing. For example, in the izai, there's a couple of those string crossings that I actually do want to make it jagged a little bit. But it all really becomes intuitive and it comes from where you want in your ear. So I hope that was helpful, and I will see you on the next Stevens Studio. Bye.